Shalom Aleichem, good morning. It is Monday, Vov Adarishan Hey Tov Shin Pei Beis, and we're learning the second sheet on the Maimer Vayakheil Moshe from Tov Shin Yutes. I want to begin by saying that today is the Yahtzait of the RaShaG. He passed away in Tov Shin Memtes 1989, which makes this his 33rd Yahtzait, Lamed Gimel, Lag. The RaShaG was, quote, the older son-in-law of the Friedrich Rebbe. He was chosen by the Rebbe RaShaG to be a chosen. And of course the rumor is, the shmua is, that he was chosen because the Rebbe Neshama felt that he was so immersed in Chassidus that he had no shayches to anything which had to do with Hepech HaTahara. That's what I heard, that's the rumor. He was a son of Reb Mendel Gerari. There were three Gerari brothers that were very famous and very wealthy, Reb Mendel and Reb Nosson and Reb Shmuel Gerari. And they were Greise Gvirim. They lived in Kremenchuk and also very big Chassidim. And Menachem Mendel Gerari was RaShaG's father. His brothers Shmuel and Nosson passed away right after the revolution for whatever reasons. He got permission from the Friedrich Rebbe to leave Russia, and I think he passed away in 1947. He lived many years. Menachem Mendel. The RaShaG was the oldest son of the Friedrich Rebbe. His wedding took place, I think, during the Neshama of the Rebbe RaShaG. He was a chosen when the Rebbe Neshama passed away, and it says in the Sefer Shkafta the Rebbe that he was called in as Hamayuad Liyes Chosnei to get a bracha from the Rebbe Neshama who passed away Moshe Shabbos Kedesh Pashas Vayikra Eir Lebeis Nissen Hey Tov Reish Pei in Rostov. I think the wedding took place in Shnasa Avelis. There was such poverty in the house that they didn't have money to buy a fleshel bramfen, a bottle of mashke, and they served limonade. There was a chassid who made a living selling lemonade. And that's what they said l'chaim, and there was incredible poverty during his wedding. He was around by the Rebbe Rayatz during all the Russia years, from what I understand. And he moved with the Rebbe from Rayatz, from Rostov to Leningrad. And then when the Rebbe left Russia, obviously the Friedrich Rebbe left Russia, he left along with him. I don't know how involved he was in the Askonis and the public works of the Rebbe Rayatz Friedrich Rebbe in Russia or after he left Russia, but I know that when they came to America, the RaShaG gave him the yeshiva. The Friedrich Rebbe gave RaShaG the yeshiva Stem Chetmimim. He gave the Rebbe, our Rebbe, the Rebbe Zal Gesund sein, all the new meisters, most importantly America Zanyan Chinuch and Machane Yisrael, and Ein Sof for him Kahos. There's a letter from the Rebbe where he writes to Harav Gringlas that he was given 4 jobs and that the 4th was the union of Chavre Kadisha, and the RaShaG was given the yeshiva, and he was the older son-in-law. And then of course when the Friedrich Rebbe passed away, there was a while that there was a little bit of confusion, but I don't know how early on, but pretty early on, the RaShaG gave himself over to the Rebbe. He became the Rebbe Sachosid. And there's some very powerful stories about his feelings of his kashrus to the Rebbe, which were demonstrated publicly. And I know from people who were close to him that any time a Sechel or a Maimer came out from the Rebbe, he wanted to have it immediately. If there was any Torah that had just come out fresh from the Rebbe, he would stop what he was doing and he would learn the Rebbe's Torah. B'chlal, I heard from people who worked with him in Ocean Park where he spent 3/4 of his day in his office sitting and learning Torah, as opposed to being the Menal Pale of the Yeshiva's Time Chetmimim, the financial side. And of course at the end of his life, he had the ultimate Mesiras Nefesh for the Rebbe when he literally had to separate from his own family to support the Rebbe when it came to the Pashas HaSfarim, which touched the Rebbe so very deeply. So first of all, you may recall that when they had the groundbreaking for the expansion of 770, which took place right before Chayel Tavshim Memches to Memtes, the Rebbe asked the RaShaG to speak a few words before him, and he did. And then he passed away in Tavshim Memtes 1989. The Rebbe went to his Levaya, to the Beis HaChaim with Mishtatef and the Levaya. Then the Rebbe davened every one of the tefillas in his dira during Shiva. The Rebbe at that time was davening every Shachas Mincha Ma'ariv with the minyan, not just Mincha Ma'ariv, but Shachris also. The Rebbe davened in his dida, in the apartment of the RaShaG, all the tefillas, and most uniquely, that the Rebbe wanted a hakamas hamatzeva, which the Rebbe did not do for his own mother and for his own wife. The Rebbe was not mishtatev in the hakamas hamatzeva. The Chaver HaKadosh did it quietly. I'm saying this parenthetically, that in Tafshin Chav Hey, there was no custom. People went, they put up the matzeva, in fact, for the Rebbe's mother. And Rav Zalman Duchman, who frequented the oil, he would go to the Frierdiker Rebbe often. When he was there, after they put up the matzeva for the Rebbe's mother, he said some kapitlach tilim by her tzion, and then he came back and he told the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was very happy. When the RaShaG had the hakamas hamatzeva, the Rebbe went himself to the Beis HaChaim. There's films of it. The Rebbe standing literally next to his grave and saying the kapitlach tilim. There was a kuntres given out with which psukim to say, which kapitlach to say. And then, the following year, in Tafshin Nun, the Rebbe asked to print a kuntres for his Yahtzait, his first Yahtzait, and they gave it the kuntres, the Maimer Kol Yisrael Yesh Lam Chelek Le'el Mabah, which is about Gan Eden and El Mabah and Tchias HaMesim, from Tafshin Lamedal from 1974, if I'm not mistaken. But probably the most incredible thing that Rebbe said about the RaShaG was that Malahala named the Neshama Afkan. This is the easiest that the Rebbe Rayat used about the Rebbe RaShaG, and of course the Rebbe used it about the Frierdiker Rebbe. But the Rebbe said publicly about his shvager, these easiest Malahala named the Neshama Afkan, just as before he served as the Menal Pel of Temchet Mimim, he continues to do his purpose as the Menal Pel of Yeshivas Temchet Mimim. Now, he sat across from the Rebbe during all the meals by the Frierdiker Rebbe, during the lifetime of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and then of course after the Histalkus. He became a chosser of the Rebbe's. I don't know at what point, and I don't know the degrees, and I'm not a maven, and I'm not a porker. I'm not an expert in these things, and I'd rather not know. But he over time he became very dedicated to the Rebbe, very ibegig Eben. It wasn't a simple matter for him because of factors that perhaps were out of his control, but nevertheless he was a very strong chassid of the Rebbe's. I heard from people who know that he asked the Rebbe everything. He didn't make a move without asking the Rebbe, without consulting with the Rebbe. And there was an occasion where they were sitting together at a Suda, and the RaShaG said something to the Rebbe that we're all sitting here together, that he's hoping that after Mashiach comes we'll also be able to be together, something to that effect. And he was saying it because he wanted that the closeness that he had with the Rebbe at that point should continue later. And the Rebbe responded to him, we're all sitting by the same table, implying that the Rebbe affirmed this bakosha. There is a story which is way before my time. I mean, my father heard it from Rebbe, that once on a Shabbos he took a lot of wine publicly, and he spoke in front of everybody about how he went to the oil of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and he said to the Frierdiker Rebbe that everything he has, all the koichas that he may have as older son-in-law, he's giving over to the Rebbe, and he's giving himself away to the Rebbe completely, and he's asking one thing, and the Rebbe is all mechalten, that the Rebbe should hold me. And I remember seeing an occasion in one of the last Simchas Torahs where he danced with the Rebbe. He had a stroke in 1980 in Tafshin Mem Aleph, and as a consequence of that, he missed those hakafas. But beginning with Mem Beis for the next few years, I don't know how many, till Mem Vav or Mem Zayin, I'm not certain, he again danced with the Rebbe, but he was fragile. He was not steady on his feet. And I remember once that the Rebbe and the RaShaG finished dancing their hakafa, and the RaShaG was holding the Sefer Torah in his left hand, as they did. They used to put their right hands on their respective shoulders. And parenthetically, I heard that when the RaShaG was in the hospital, Mem Aleph, he asked whom did the Rebbe dance with by the hakafas, and they told him that the Rebbe danced alone, and the RaShaG was so happy to hear that this was his, that when the Rebbe didn't dance with the RaShaG, the Rebbe didn't dance with anybody else, that this was his. And I saw physically that RaShaG staggered, and he was going to fall, and the Rebbe physically grabbed him and held him. And I saw B'muchash what he had asked the Rebbe many, many years earlier, the Rebbe's al mechalten, the Rebbe should hold me. And then of course there's a story which went around recently where that RaShaG was once very, very, very emotional. That he cried during the Hakafas, and he cried during the night, and he was crying the next day. And then that after Tisha, he wrote the Rebbe a letter of unbelievable emotion and feeling close. And the story that goes with it is that the Rebbe said to the RaShaG as they were dancing, Der Hakafa, the Rebbe, the Shver, Tzvans mit uns, the Friedrich Rebbe is dancing with us. And the Rebbe, RaShaG, of course, agreed. And then the Rebbe asked him if he wishes to see. And he said, yeah. Now, I don't know what he saw, but whatever it was that he saw, because, again, I don't remember this, but this is a story that went around in the last few years, that he was incredibly emotional after that for a very long time. And then he wrote a very, very warm letter. And again, the shmua is that the Rebbe was maileim to a place where he was able to see things that most people do not see. It's not unprecedented. We have such stories by the earlier Rebbeim as well. In any case, so today's is Yahtzait. And we spoke about him, and it should be a schus for him. Our whole Yiddishkeit and our whole connection to Atzmas and Ein Sof Baruch Hu is the Rebbe the Nasi Ador. And this is not an inyan from Emunah, this is an inyan from Metzias. Everybody knows and feels that when you're connected and close to the Rebbe, you're a better Yid, you're closer to the Eibshter. And when Chas v'Sholom, you somehow feel, as the expression is in Yiddish, Sam Sapozhnik, on my own shoemaker, I can make the tefillin myself. So it becomes cold and it becomes dry. And when we talk about the RaShaG, we're really talking about his kashrus, about a connection to the Rebbe, to our Rebbe. And Hashem should bless us all that we should be mekusher, and we should feel mekusher, and we should experience mekusher. And then, of course, we should live mekusher, like Yidden, as the Eibshter and the Rebbe wants us to be, and to live b'poil, practically. Okay, that one a little bit longer than I would have liked, but now let's get to the Maimer. In the last class, we learned about Gan Eden. And what we explained about Gan Eden is that Gan Eden is a place of Tainug HaSaga. In Gan Eden, you don't only understand godliness in a very high level, as is removed from a Gashmi's Dikaguf, and therefore from any kind of tzir and mitzias, but there's also something called Tainug HaSaga, that you understand godliness, and along with the understanding, there's the actual experience of the godliness itself. And the mashal for experiencing the godliness from the understanding of godliness is pleasure, is delight. And I explained briefly, perhaps inadequately, but I explained briefly why or how Tainug is the experience of the Ein Sof. And we further explained that there's an infinite number of levels of Gan Eden. And each level of Gan Eden is separated from the other levels of Gan Eden because of the degree of Hasaga, how much the Malachim and the Neshamas Yisrael and that Gan Eden understand. And the separation between one Gan Eden and a second Gan Eden in terms of understanding is limited. But the Tainug of one Gan Eden, the Tainug of the Hasaga in one Gan Eden, versus the Tainug of the Hasaga in a different Gan Eden, this is separated bligvul. So the Tainug HaSaga, the delight from understanding godliness, first of all, is Ein Sof, is infinite, is bligvul. And the separation from one Gan Eden, another Gan Eden, in terms of Tainug, is also infinite. And then the Rebbe asked a question. The question was that the Neshama is limited, the Neshama is a mugbal. Nברא, as he calls it. How could a Neshama, which is a Nברא, receive Ein Sof without it being overwhelming? That was the question. And the Rebbe answered, because there's a malbush, there's a garment. And he gave us a dogma from Moshe Rabbeinu, that in Moshe Rabbeinu's case, he needed a malbush for his guf, because he went with his guf l'mayla. That his neshama, his guf, should be able to receive hasaga l'kis. And then he said, the same is true by us. A neshama in Gan Eden doesn't have a guf, but it has a neshama. The neshama is also Matthias and a mugbal. It needs a malbush to receive the Ein Sof. This is what he said b'kitzer. And he connected to what it says in the Gersa Kedesh. And he doesn't articulate the Gersa Kedesh, but I mentioned it in the Shir, that in the Gersa Kedesh it says that there's something called Ne'em Hashem. Ne'em Havai is Ein Sof, is Tainug. And in order for us to experience Ne'em Hashem, we have to have a Livush which can conduct Ein Sof. So the language is that there's something called Sevev Kalama. There's a Malak Kalaman and Sevev Kalama. Sevev Kalaman is a godliness which has no limit, and therefore it's always considered in a state of concealment, Helam. The Neshama in Gan Eden is supposed to be able to experience Ein Sof HaSevev Kalaman, and the question is how. So the Rebbe explains that the last madrega of Sevav Kalalman is called Ratzon. And from Ratzon we have mitzvahs, so mitzvahs are Sevav Kalalman. And therefore the mitzvahs that we have from the Ratzon become a malbush, which allows us to receive the Ne'em Havai. That's what it says in Tanya, that the Livush, the garment, that allows us to receive the Ein Sof Sevav Kalalman, and that it should reach us, and that it shouldn't overwhelm and destroy the Neshama, is a Livush of Sevav Kalalman itself. And the Rebbe said the same is true. Neshama in Gan Eden is able to experience the Tainuk, which is Ein Sof, of that Gan Eden, or of all Gan Edens, v'chuli v'chuli, because it has a malbush, it has a garment. And the garment is itself Ein Sof, and therefore conducts Ein Sof. And in the language of the Maimer, this garment doesn't hide the Ein Sof from the Neshama. It just diminishes some of the Havhaka and the Havhara. The Rebbe uses very, very beautiful Bihikus and Bihirus of the light. The Ein Sof is incredibly radiant and bright, and it's blinding and overwhelming and destructive to the Neshama. So the Livush, the Malbush, which the Neshama has in order to be able to receive the Ein Sof, diminishes it somewhat, but not that the Neshama receives none of the Ein Sof, because then what's the point? It receives some of the Ein Sof through this Malbush, which diminishes the Ein Sof to be able to receive it. Now, I told you in the end of the last Shia that I would try and find Oisius of Hezbollah for this, and I have nothing to say. I don't have Oisius of Hezbollah. I'll just say this. The idea that a malbush, that a garment, diminishes something, not for the sake of hiding it, but for the sake of actually bringing it to us in a way that we're able to deal with it and cope with it, is not that uncommon. There are many, many, many illustrations and circumstances and examples for this very phenomenon, that you have to have a malbush which diminishes the Ein Sof in order for a keli to be able to receive it. For example, in Chassidus they bring 4 different mishalim for Eisius Harishima. They bring the mashal of Derech Kitzara, they bring the mashal of a mashal, they bring the mashal of a remez, and they bring the mashal of a chida. Meaning to say, you want to communicate something to somebody else, and that somebody else cannot receive it as it is, so you find a medium for communication. But the medium for communication is not taking it away. The medium for communication is actually communicating it through the medium, meaning to say the recipient is getting something less, something different, something altered, but they're receiving it, and then of course through a process, through an extrapolatory process, they can come to get what they were not able to get directly originally because it was too potent. So the idea of a mashal, of a levush, of a garment, whatever that garment is, that a kitzara, or like one of the classic mishalim in Chassidus is the mashal of a mashal, it's the mashal of a parsa. A secondary idea, which brings the original idea to a person through the secondary, and then the person has to extrapolate backwards from the mashal to the nimshal, is classic in Chassidus. It's classic in Chassidus. And it illustrates how a higher oid is brought to a lower level in a way that it reaches the lower level, and it reaches the lower level in a diminished state. The reason this is a problem here is because those metaphors represent the mashal of Rav and Talmud, teacher and student, that are communicating ideas, and ideas are finite. We're talking about communicating Ein Sof, Tainug. And I guess specifically Tainug of Ein Sof, Hasevav Kalalman. You need a different kind of illustration, you need a different kind of explanation to explain how godliness can be put into a garment which is going to diminish the godliness, that after the diminution it's still godliness and it still it reaches the recipient and it's diminished. Because it's very, very difficult to understand the phenomena of reduction and infinity, and it should remain infinity. It either is or it isn't. So it's really difficult to find oisius of Hezbollah, words that explain logically and philosophically this phenomena that our Maimon is describing, that the Neshama in Gan Eden is given garments that diminish the Tainug, the Ein Sof, which reaches it, but diminishes it in such a way that the Neshama receives it, but it receives it in a diminished way. So I don't have, I pledged to find Asius of Hezbollah, and I'm remaining with the pledge. I don't have any Asius of Hezbollah. But I will say this. That's really how you understand Nevua. To use Nevua as a mashal is funny, right? Nevua is a nimshal. Nevua, and on a lower level, Ruach HaKodesh. As you know, the Tanakh has 3 madregas. Torah, Nevua, and Ruach HaKodesh. The Chamisha Chumshei Torah is the madrega of Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu received the Torah peh peh, face to face, mouth to mouth. Hashem spoke the words and Moshe Rabbeinu heard them. That's the highest madrega. I think there's a Sechel from the Rebbe someplace where he talks about the difference between Torah and Nevua. But there's no explanations of the process because Moshe is the only one. And Moshe isn't. Even when Mashiach comes, it says it's not going to be Matan Torah Eida Pam. Even Moshe Rabbeinu cannot come by Mechadish Ein Navi Yochel Lechadish Dava Meyata, including Moshe Rabbeinu. So there's no hezber for how Moshe Rabbeinu received from HaKadosh Baruch. Nevua, they discussed at length in the Rambam and in the Livushim and in other Svarim and in Chassidus, the process of Nevua. And Ruach HaKodesh is the same idea in a lower madrega. Nevua means not just words. The experience of a Navi is not that Hashem has a message for him. That's not Nevua. The experience of Nevua is vision. You experience Ein Sof. And that's why you find in the Svarim that the Nevi'im would fall on the floor and they would take off their clothes and they would do crazy things because they were shocked, they were overwhelmed by the experience of the Nevua, of the Oyer Leki, of the Nevua. So there's 2 sides. One side is that the Navi was overwhelmed by the experience. And the other side is that the Navi wasn't overwhelmed to the extent that it destroyed him. Which means that the Nevua, which is an experience of Ein Sof, comes to the Navi through some kind of a medium that diminishes it enough for him to be able to receive it and doesn't diminish it for him so much that it shouldn't be the original thing. Well, this doesn't help. It's not explaining the nature of the Malbush in Gan Eden for the Neshama to be able to receive Ein Sof. It simply transfers it to another circumstance where you have a similar idea, which is, of course, very difficult to comprehend. And I'm going to have to stop with this because I don't have any more. He says husband. I just don't have any more. So, having spent 10 or 11 minutes on the RaShaG, 10 or 11 minutes on the Chozer, let's get to the Maimed. We're on page 76. We're holding Sif Hey. Our Maimed, as you know, is about the Kir. And that the Kir was created by Mare Satsevis, from looking glasses, which are called Tseves, Ashetzav Yisrael Pesach Eyel Meyed. So the Rebbe explains everything al Pi Kabbalah, that Mares Loshan Rabim doesn't mean many mirrors, it means many levels of mirrors. And he connects it to 2 basic madreges, Aspaklarya HaMeira, looking glass which is radiant, and Aspaklarya She'ina Meira, looking glass which is not radiant. Aspaklarya HaMeira means a looking glass that allows you to see what you need to see directly. Like a magnifying glass or a regular microscope or a telescope that allows you to see what you're looking at directly. You see it. Aspaklarya She'ina Meira means a looking glass that doesn't allow you to see directly, you see indirectly. The classic example of Aspaklarya She'ina Meira is a mirror. Where you don't see through it, you see yourself reflected back at you, which is called Khayzer. And I would argue that the most modern forms of I guess the word is telemetry. I'm not an expert on language or on these ideas, but that allows us to see things that are so tiny that we don't see them physically, we see them electronically, what they call electron microscopes, would also be considered as Aspaklarya She'ina Meira. You're not seeing the object directly, you're seeing the object through an interpretation. And that's the difference between Aspaklarya HaMeira and Aspaklarya She'ina Meira. Aspaklarya HaMeira means that you're seeing through a tool that helps you see, but you're seeing the original item directly. And Aspaklarya She'ina Meira means you're using a tool to allow yourself to see something that you cannot see without it, and you're seeing it indirectly. And these 2 levels, Aspaklarya HaMeira and Aspaklarya She'ina Meira, is used in Chazal to explain the difference between the Nevua of Moshe Rabbeinu and the Nevua of the other Nevi'im, that the other Nevi'im saw through Aspaklarya HaMeira, and Moshe Rabbeinu, the other Nevi'im saw through Aspaklarya She'ina Meira, and Moshe Rabbeinu saw through Aspaklarya HaMeira. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu said Zeh HaDavar, and they said Koi. And the point is that the kir, which was used to wash the hands, which needed to be done before you went into the Beis HaMikdash, do any AVODA, that will always remind you of Moshe Rabbeinu, because the kir needed to have a minimum of 4 faucets, Moshe, V'yadenu, Bonav, that for posterity, for history, in the Kiyah there was a reference made to Moshe Rabbeinu as having been a Kohen, B'chaluk Lovan, for the week of the Miluyim, is because the Kiyah is a setup for all the avodas in the Beis HaMikdash. You can't do anything in the Beis HaMikdash without the Kiyah, and therefore you can't have the Kiyah without Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Kiyah was made from manas, from tools that are necessary when you cannot see directly, and they assist in vision using this medium. And either the Aspaklarya Me'ira, they're using this tool to be able to see and you're seeing directly, or it's Aspaklarya She'ina, you're using the tool to see and you're seeing indirectly. What's the point? The reason you cannot see can either be because it's too hidden from you, or in this case, the reason you cannot see because it's too bright, have haka and have horror, it's too radiant, and you need the tool to diminish what it is that you want to see so that you should be able to see it. So the Maimer wants to explain to us the Kabbalah, the Chassidus of the material from which the Kiyah was made. The Kiyah is a very, very important avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. You can't go in without washing your hands. And it has a permanent reference to Moshe Rabbeinu's involvement in the Beis HaMikdash, because the koyach for the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash and for washing your hands come from Moshe Rabbeinu. And it had to be made from tools that assist in vision. And as the Rebbe is going to explain later, that means you need a tool in order to be able to see because you cannot see directly. But the fact that you're using a tool to be able to see will turn out to be hugely advantageous, as you'll see later on in Mirz Hashem in this class. So, we're done with the Gan Eden, we're done with the Livushim Gan Eden, and we're talking about madas. That there's two kinds of looking glasses that both assist in vision. Without them you cannot see. Through them you're able to see directly, indirectly, but what you're seeing is diminished. And on one level, quote, at least you see something. And on the second level, we're going to discover that seeing through this tool is actually going to be seen as a maila over seeing directly, as we're going to explain later on. So let's go to the Maimer. And in Peirik Hey, the Rebbe explains Aspaklarya She'ina Me'ira in the Mashal and in the Nimshal. And it seems to me that when you go through this Maimer, he already mentioned Aspaklarya Me'ira in the end of the previous paragraph, but he mentioned it in the light of Gan Eden. It seems to me that this discussion on Aspaklarya She'ina Me'ira is really meant to be seen as before the discussion on Aspaklarya HaMe'ira, although on the next page, 78, he doesn't give Aspaklarya HaMe'ira the same kind of attention as he gives to Aspaklarya She'ina Me'ira. But we're going to start now and learn. We're going to learn Aspaklarya She'ina Me'ira, and when we finish this, I'll sort of try to fill in what I think is said bekitzit in the Maimer, and I hope I'm not wrong, obviously, and Hashem HaTev Yebezri. So here we go. We discussed in the beginning of the Maimer, on page 73, when he brought the pasuk about the Kiyah b'madas atzevis lashon rabim. There's two levels of looking glass, tools that allow you to see. You cannot see directly, you have to see through a keli. Beis madas, two kinds of tools of vision. Aspaklarya me'ira, a looking glass that allows you to see with light, which means to see directly, which is called in Chassidus Yasha. And Aspaklarya She'ina Me'ira, a looking glass that's not radiant, it doesn't allow you to see directly, you see it indirectly, which is called Chozer. The Rebbe says, let's first explain the idea of Aspaklarya She'ina Me'ira, a looking glass that wants you to see, or that you need in order to be able to see. But you're not able to see directly. You're not able to even see through the looking glass directly. You're only able to see through the looking glass indirectly. Says the Rebbe, this means there is something the looking glass itself blocks and hides. Because the light that you wish to see is very radiant, very powerful. It's mavhik and it's mavhir, as the Rebbe said in the previous paragraph. And if one were to experience Ein Sof directly, it would be overwhelming, and therefore you have a looking glass whose role it is to cover that up, to prevent you from seeing it. Aval, at the same time, it's not preventing you from seeing anything. To the contrary, the whole reason for the looking glass is to allow you to look and see. But it's a look-see that's through a medium, and a medium which allows you to see only through a translation, indirectly. That the purpose of this blockage is that you cannot see the substance of that thing as it is in its own place. You cannot see it directly, and you cannot see it as it is. You're seeing a secondary image of it. I think physically the idea of an electron microscope is a great illustration of this idea. you're seeing a picture of the original thing. It's not the original thing. It's a mechanically or an electromagnetically created image. And this is mysticism, of course. This is pnimius atera. You want to see godliness and you can't. So you need a keli. But the keli is not just diminishing the godliness that you want to see, it's hiding it completely. And it's presenting you with something alternative, something else, which is the demus of that original idea of godliness, what you're seeing indirectly. So this is the effect of this cover. If there was no cover, you would be able to see directly, or at least you'd be able to see through a looking glass, which is called me'ira, which means you would see the original thing directly. But because we're dealing with aspeklariyah she'ina me'ira, a looking glass that doesn't allow direct observation, direct vision, only indirect observation. You see it, but literally archeza means a rebounding light. You're seeing it indirectly. You're seeing something else which is represented of the original thing. To use a very, very simple example of Yasher and Chozer, where teachers teach and students learn. And not every teacher is Zeichen that every one of his students learns. And not every one of his teachers is Zeichen that the student should become himself a teacher. But very often in the student-teacher relationship, the teacher says something and the student says it in other words. The student is saying it in other words because the words of the teacher are too strong and they leave him confused and they leave him feeling frustrated about lack of clarity. So when he gives it back to the teacher in his own words, he sort of dulls it down. He diminishes it enough that he should feel like at least a part of it that he has clearly. Now what the student tells back to the teacher is different than what the teacher told him. But it's consistent with what the teacher told him. It's only in other words. He takes out of it anything which is vague to him, which is obscure and nebulous. The teacher speaks in a certain way because he's hinting at all kinds of subliminal things that he's hoping the student is going to come to over time. And the student senses that the teacher is saying more than the teacher is saying. So by saying it in other words, he's simplifying it for himself. So let's say that the other words that the student uses will be al derech mashal d'mus. The teacher tells him something, he gets something different from it which is consistent with what the teacher gave him. But it's not only a diminished version of what the teacher said, it's a secondary thing, it's something else. That's what the word mus means. You may know in Hasidus there's a sugya of tzelem and mus. The sugya of tzelem and mus briefly is when people have ideas, they come from the subconscious. And when ideas come from the subconscious, they come along with words. The words that come along with an idea that comes from the subconscious are very sharp, they're very powerful words. People as a rule, it says in Tanya Perek Hey Gersa Kedesh, don't pay attention to the words. The words come as a byproduct of the light of the ideas that emerges from the subconscious to the consciousness, from the Neshama to the person. But the words are also coming from the subconscious. And the original language that emerge along with an idea from the subconscious is called tzelem. They have a property, they have a quality that's called etzem. They're a reflection of how that person's mind is by himself. When a person uses other words to say the same thing, that's called demus. And the lashon of the Maimorim is it's called tzura atzmis and tzura mitzura. Tzura atzmis means the original form. The form is that reflects the person by himself. And tzura means a form of a form, a secondary form. And that's how you understand aspeklariyah she'ina me'ira. You want to see godliness, but directly you cannot see it. So you need a tool. And even seeing it directly through the tool, which would be the madreg of aspeklariyah me'ira, you're not able to. So you see it indirectly through the tool. So you're not seeing the original idea at all, you're seeing it mus. And the only mashal I have to illustrate this would be Nevi'im. Nevi'im saw an image. And the image was not just a picture, it had a potency, it had a power of Ein Sof, which they experienced as a divine force. I don't know if you could say they experienced it as a divine richness, which is al derech mashal tainug, which is the madreg of Moshe Rabbeinu l'chayra. They experienced it as a divine force, which is al derech mashal ratzon. So they have this idea that's nisrakim, or the lashon of the Maimorim is that's nechkak, that appears in their consciousness, an image, a form, a dmus, that's a metaphor for a message from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the credibility of that is not the image as it emerges from the subconscious to the consciousness, it's the power behind it. The power behind it is the Ein Sof that they're experiencing, and the image is representing it, and it's called the dmus, because they're not seeing what the Eibishter is showing them. What the Eibishter is showing, they're not able to see. They're seeing what their body and their brain is able to process from what the Eibishter showed them, and they take away this secondary form. This is called the mus. It's called aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira, a looking glass that only allows you to see indirectly, but it actually reveals something rather than hides. Now, I know that you know that I'm saying so little about something that requires so much time. But this is all I'm going to give it, because this is all we have. And the Rebbe says, 5 lines from the bottom of page 76, Hakisui, tzarech liyas kisui, even this covering, which doesn't allow direct vision, it only allows indirect vision. It's called a thin covering, because through this covering you see something, but what you're seeing is a secondary image, is a processed image rather than a natural image. Ki im yiyeh kisei of, it was a thicker covering, I said it would swallow the light completely, you would have nothing. Would cover completely, and of course that's not the point. Hashem doesn't create tools to allow us to see that blind us completely. Considering that the garment is thin, it doesn't hide totally, you're able to see what's called an indirect light. An indirect light means a teacher teaches, that's called direct light. The student processes and takes something what the teacher said, that's called indirect light. What the student gets, that I called before in other words, comes from the teacher. But it comes from the teacher as it's qualified by the student. That's called seeing indirectly, with the help of an extraneous influence, namely the mind and the imagination of the student. And the same is true in Nevua, not on an intellectual level, but on an inspirational level. And this is called aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira. It's a tool that you need to see because you can't see without it. Moreover, it's a tool that you need to see because you cannot see without it, that allows you to see by blocking. And what you're seeing is a secondary form. This is a hezbed on aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira. Now, aspaklariyah me'ira, the Rebbe mentioned earlier on this page very briefly, and he's going to mention it again on the next page, on page 78. I'll talk a little bit about aspaklariyah me'ira when we get to page 78. But now comes the first twist in this discussion. So far we're talking about the need for garments because the light is too potent, you can't see directly. Says Rebbe Vayakheil, I want to say something else. Number one, the aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira doesn't only hide, it also reveals. Its purpose is to deliver something that's very high to a recipient who's not as high, by qualifying it, by translating it, by altering it sufficiently for them to receive what they're able to receive. Not that they should receive nothing. But obviously what they're receiving is secondary or tertiary because they can't see directly. But there's another side of the coin. And that is aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira, that a looking glass that hides and allows you to see only indirectly, yesh maila, has an advantage over seeing directly, and even gam al aspaklariyah me'ira, seeing through a looking glass which allows you to see directly. In other words, when you're blocked and you need to translate the original vision into a secondary form, there's advantage over not being blocked and seeing directly. Why? Key, the reason is, aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira, when the looking glass doesn't allow you to see directly, it only allows you to see indirectly. You see yourself what's behind you. Because the classic example of aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira is a mirror. And like I said to you before, I believe that physically you could use as an example an electron microscope. Now when the Rebbe says you see yourself or you see what's behind you, means you see what's being shown to you in the context of yourself. Hashem is showing himself to you. Aspaklariyah she'ina me'ira brings Hashem or Hashemliness to a status, to a condition, to a circumstances that you experience it in the context of yourself. So even though it's necessary because we're not sensitive enough, it comes from a chasad, and it has a huge advantage that when we're experiencing the godliness, we're experiencing it along with ourselves. If a person was on a higher level and could see the light directly, or like Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevua, aspaklariyah me'ira, there's a tool that allows him to see. Without that tool he wouldn't see, but the tool allows him to see directly. When you see godliness, even through a tool, and you see it directly, you're not a part of the experience, just the godliness. You're lost in it. This explains what you find in the Gemara. The Gemara asks a question. The Yeshaya says, I see God. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, it's impossible to see godliness and live. So the Gemara asks, if Moshe Rabbeinu says you can't see God and live, how could Yeshaya say, I'm seeing? And the answer is, because the Nevi'im were on a lower level and they saw godliness through a tool, a looking glass, through a utensil which only allows them to see indirectly. And Moshe Rabbeinu used a tool, a looking glass, that allows them to see directly. So when you're seeing godliness directly, if the godliness is too bright, it'll overwhelm you. But when you're seeing the godliness indirectly, because of the chesaron, there's a maila, there could be an inyan for eros havaya. And that's what Yeshaya is saying. I'm able to see godliness in a way that Moshe wasn't, because I'm seeing it through an interpretation. In other words, when you have a looking glass which obstructs and doesn't allow you to see directly, it only allows you to see indirectly. You're allowed to see the kinds of things that you'll never be able to see through a direct looking glass. That in the darkness you see things indirectly. When you see things indirectly, you're able to see more. In the Geras HaKedesh Shimon Yutes in Tanya, the 19th letter, the Alter Rebbe discusses the fact that Nevi'im are only able to see in Atzilus, and in Atzilus itself, the lower parts of Atzilus. And the Mekubalim were able to see much, much higher, and he's curious about it. And the answer in one word is that Nevi'im have what's called Riyah Chushis, a vivid vision, and the Mekubalim has called Riyah Sichles, an intellectual vision, which is on a much, much lower level, but they're able to see much, much higher. That conversation is very similar to this conversation. Torah is emes, and through Torah the truth is revealed. And sometimes in darkness, with Yigiyah, without Yigiyah, one kind of Yigiyah, another kind of Yigiyah, you find truths that you could never know directly, you can only know them indirectly. And part of the reason is because of the hardships of having to uncover it. And part of the reason is because of the darkness itself, the blockage itself. Because the blockage itself has a higher shirish than the light. And when you manage to be mavared, how that blockage is blocking you, and more deeply you're able to mavared the blockage itself, so you discover a light, albeit indirectly, that you would never know otherwise. And I don't want to be ma'irich in this either, for a variety of different reasons. And most notably, most basically, because we don't have any more time. But this is the Nekudas HaDover, that when you're blocked and you see less through a blockage, through that less you can sometimes know more than you would know if you were able to see it directly. And the Rebbe continues, Ubir inyan aspaklarya she'ina meira b'avedas adam. We just explained the phenomena of a looking glass that allows you to see godliness indirectly. It's called the Dmus. We spoke about its advantage because of the mile of Eir Chesed. You see yourself, and the way I explained seeing yourself, you mean you see the godliness in context of yourself. How do you explain this in life, in Avodas Hashem? So the Rebbe says, "Hu inyan ha'er shemeir adei haveda behel b'nefesh abhamis." We have a body, an animal soul. Klipa, we're involved with klipa. Klipa blocks our neshama. And when we struggle to overcome the blockages of the neshama that klipa gives us, we know our neshama through the blockage. So we know the neshama in a diminished way because we're knowing it through the blockage, which would be the first point, and in an interesting way we somehow know more of our neshama than we would know if we didn't have those blockages, which is the second idea. So aspaklarיא שאינה מאירה AVODA means the malbush of klipa, basically. The animal soul's obstruction is it hides godliness. However, the animal soul is not such a thick, such a dense blockage. In other words, as opposed to other klipas. Because there's only klipas negen has some good. And this, of course, is enhanced. The person uses his divine soul to purify his animal soul. So the animal soul in its more refined state certainly is considered a Livush zach that allows some of what the Neshama is to shine through. Therefore, even though the animal soul remains where it was, the animal soul continues to obstruct. Nevertheless, the animal soul by its nature. And the animal soul after Avodah Adam is considered a refined blockage. And therefore the Neshama shines through the animal soul's challenges and the challenge of the animal soul itself. But understand the upside. The light which you come to know through the blockage of the animal soul is it's called an indirect light. In other words, Shesh Maila has a huge advantage. You can able to reach a place. You'd never be able to reach there by seeing the light directly. In other words, the Neshama is very strong. And when the Neshama comes into the Guf, if the Neshama would shine without the obstruction of the Guf of the Nefesh HaBahmis, you would never be able to see that level of the Neshama, because it would not be able to live in the Guf. It would destroy the Guf. But because the Neshama is blocked, and you overcome the blockage, you uncover powers within the Neshama that you're able to experience consciously in the Guf, because it was obstructed. This is the real reason Hashem puts the Neshama in the body and the animal soul. It's a great descent. It's not only for the struggle, it's for the discovery of the godliness of the Neshama. We discussed earlier the Neshama as it's created is the level of Rakia, being firmament, fixed. Above that it's fluid. And even higher than that, it's in the level of absolute formlessness, nebulousness, like oil. The Neshama's roots are in Madregas, and the way the Neshama is Kedem Atzimtzum, it has no definition at all. I think it has no individuation at all. Bracket. It exists even Kedem Atzimtzum. As I told you in the previous shir, is not a level. It's a philosophical form for explaining Hishtalshalos. And there is 1,000 different circumstances where you could use those three ideas of Emet. The Rebbe applied it to the Neshama, and he applies it to the Neshama and Lifnei HaTzimtzum. To be sure, the Neshama, in its highest sources, is not only higher than the Ki and higher than Mayim, but it's even higher than Oid, even Oid Lifnei HaTzimtzum. As the Pasuk says, Im HaMelech Memlachti Yashvu Sham V'Amar Arzal B'mi Nimlach, but there's a place, Vayakheil, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu consults with Neshama Yisrael whether he should create the world. The place where Hashem is consulting with Neshama to create the world is where the Neshama is so formless that you can't even call it Oir, has no individuation whatsoever. Nevertheless, Misham Yad Alamata Baguf, and Neshama descends all the way into a body into animal soul, which is indeed an incredible descent. It's all worthwhile. Because the Neshama goes up to an even higher level through the Yirida, like the expression is, Yirida Tzerach Aliyah. And the Yirida Tzerach Aliyah means it goes to a higher level. And Yirida Tzerach Aliyah means it discovers a level of godliness down here that can only be known through the challenge, through the indirectness. You must say, that if the Neshama comes down in order to go up, it has to go higher than its Shadish. Now in Maimorim, B'klal, they say the Neshama is not to be Teherahi. And the Aliyah of the Neshama is V'anche Kedesh Tiyunli, from the Madreg of Tara to the Madreg of Kedusha, which is called L'shtaba B'guf of the Malka. Because it means Neshamas by themselves are the Madreg of Kelim, and they should go off the Madreg of Kelim to the Madreg of Oir. In other words, in the Sug of Neshamas being Raki and Maim and Oir, even the Oir level of the Neshama is really part of the Kelim system. And the Yidit Tzerach Aliyah is how it goes up to the Madreg of Dvekes Nikeres. That's how it's explained in many Maimorim, including in the Samach Vov. Now, what's the Rebbe going to explain here? Let's read. 8 lines from the bottom of page 77. The pshat is this. When the Neshama is in the level of Rakia, it's firmed, it's made firmament, it's made hard, fixed, limited. Water doesn't have a limit by itself, but if you put water into a cup, the cup gives it a form. So this is an indirect limitation on the Neshama, the Madrega of Mayim. The whole idea of light is that it's plain and infinite, and even when you put it into a keli, it doesn't take on the form of that keli. The very fact that it's has a limit, and the only way I can understand this is that we're talking about the Madrega of Gilui. The Metzias of Eidos Gilui. And the very fact that Eidos Gilui means that it's destined for Azulas. Even though the Azulas does not control it and limit it, the Azulas translates it, and even after it goes through the clay, like Oyer B'Klei Beguvan, the Oyer is still the same as they state in Chasidus. But the very fact that it's Gilui and is affected by a Keli is a Medida Vagbal. The light before the Tzimtzum in Haguf Shumuz Eir. The Eid is called Eid, not anything else. And again, I'm going to assume to mean Eid the matter of Gilui, Harei limitations, may not it's a reflection of Alakus. But it's a reflection of Alakus in a way of Oid. And again, I'm presuming that it doesn't mean Oid, which is Amshach of Alei Gili, means Eid, which is Gili. But I don't know. For the Neshama to become truly infinite. Meaning to say that the Neshama should not only transcend its status as Rakia, it should not only transcend its status of Mayim, it should even transcend its status of Eid, even the way the Eid is Lifnei Hatzimtzum. Has to come into the body and the animal soul in this world. They're enemies, they're opposite of godliness and struggle. And there's two parts to the struggle. Number one, overcoming the blockage, and number two, uplifting the blockage itself. This works that first of all allows the Neshama to shine through in spite of the Nefesh HaBahamis. And second, with the transform of the Nefesh HaBahamis, turn to page 78. This expresses the infinity of a person because of the challenge. And this you have Barichis and Samach Vov, and like I mentioned before, the Maim of a Yigash, which speaks about Gevura. Only down here does the Neshama access its infinity, because it has to fight and struggle, and the blockages bring out the infinity of the Neshama, and they bring out the infinity of the Neshama becomes more than the Neshama is Lamaila, even in its Shadish. And because the Neshama breaks out of its limitations and achieves what's called Mo'ay Chalcha, the Neshama's infinity, it merits that Hashem should give him, the Neshama, his infinity, which is truly infinite. Because when the Neshama expressed its own Mo'ed, which is really not infinite, it's infinite for the Neshama. It's Sechel to the Meida Elyon, which is truly infinite. The Neshama that here in this world serves Hashem at a level of Mesilas Nefesh, which is Atzmas. The Neshama is Sechel to B'Lamiti, which is not even Eid, which is the Eibush, the source of it. So the Rebbe says the AVODA of Aspaklarya Sheina Meira is the Guf and the Nefesh HaBahmis. And when the Neshama overcomes it, the Neshama becomes more than it would be without it. So let's be very clear here. We're talking about a tool that allows us to see godliness through an obstruction. And we're arguing that because we're seeing godliness through an obstruction, there's an advantage to the godliness that we're able to see over the godliness we would see without the obstruction. And in avoid the obstruction is klipa, the guf and the nefesh habamis. And overcoming the obstruction is the avodah b'chol meidecha, which is revealing the higher levels of the neshama. And again, I keep on adding, even though the Maimon doesn't say it befedish, you're actually transforming the klipa itself, and you're revealing an infinity which is beyond what the neshama is by itself. So in this Pedic, what is it? This is the first two paragraphs of Pedic Hey. We explained two things: what Aspaklarya She'ina Meira is, its advantage, and how you explain it in AVODA. Now, what about Aspaklarya HaMeira? So the Rebbe does not explain it now, but he explained it before. So I want you to do me a favor and go back to page 76. It's just a few lines. So we're going to read them again, okay? It's on page 76. It's between 13 and 14 if you're looking at the numbers that I wrote. Dugmas Adam. Adam is the beginning of a line, and I want to read this now. Adam haroya umistakel be'eritzach. A person who looks and staring at a bright light, through a looking glass that allows him to see directly. Aspaklarya, that the looking glass that allows him to see directly is also malemes al eitzam habehiras. It diminishes the intensity of the radiance. Because Aideza Efshel Kabbalah said you're getting the light directly, but you're getting it in a diminished form. You wouldn't call this, in other words, you would call this something less than in other words. I don't know what you would call it. Maybe the mashal of derech ktsara. I don't know what mashal you would use. You're seeing the original light. You're seeing the Nevua that Hashem is showing you Moshe Rabbeinu receives, but the brightness is reduced, so he should be able to receive it. That's Moshe Rabbeinu's level of Nevua, because he saw directly, which is a Aspaklarya HaMeira, and the Rebbe says that's the way of Moshe B'teicha Ona. And then by number 14, the Rebbe is al derech zayuven gam b'kolachet v'echad miyisrael b'negei l'nishmasei. The Rebbe asked how a Neshama in Gan Eden is able to experience Ein Sof, and the Rebbe says this. Listen to this: Sha'teira mitzvahs shem chachmaser tended shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Teira mitzvah we did in this world. V'yardu v'neslap shalamata descended and were revealed, were garmented physically on the earth. They are the metaphor of the looking glass that allows you to see directly. They are the garment for the Neshama, Gan Eden in Gan Eden. So now, appreciate this. The Rebbe gave much less attention to Aspaklari Meira than he did to Aspaklari She'ina Meira. Aspaklari She'ina Meira got a page and a half. From here, this, and this. Aspaklari Meira got a handful of lines. What did he say? Two things. Aspaklari Meira allows you to see directly. In other words, the godliness that he's showing you, you're seeing. Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevua was not the Moshe, it was Tselem. The image that he saw was the image that Hashem showed him without a translation. But the light had to be diminished that Moshe should be able to receive it without him being overwhelmed. I don't know what the mashal for this is. I don't. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was one of a kind. There's no other. So Chassidus doesn't explain Moshe Rabbeinu, the Sifri Machshava that explain Nevua, don't explain Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevua, because it happened one time. They just tell you Moshe Rabbeinu saw God face to face, pale pale. It was Nevua. It's not like seeing physically, it's not a Riyah Chushis, but it's the highest possible madreg of Nevua. You're seeing directly, in a diminished way. Now, you'll see soon that the Rebbe is going to say that even Aspaklari Meira, which allows you to see directly because it diminishes the light somewhat, you're not going to say that it's Vayakheil, it's seeing the light indirectly, but it does have the maila of seeing through a keli. And because it has the mile of seeing through a keli, even Aspaklari Meira has the advantage al derech Vayakheil. It's not the same thing. But because you're not able to see the full brightness of the light, you're eventually coming to see something that you wouldn't see otherwise. But the mashal is the difference. The mashal and AVODA for Aspaklari She'ina Meira is the guf and the nefesh abahmis. The mashal and AVODA for Aspaklari Meira is Teidum mitzvahs. Teidum mitzvahs reveal godliness. The guf of the nefesh abahmis conceal over godliness. But even Teidum mitzvahs package godliness in a way that we're able to receive it. So, without the Rebbe giving us a page and a half on Aspaklari Meira to allow us to understand it in step by step, we can say three things about Aspaklari Meira. Number one, Aspaklari Meira allows you to see directly, but it's still a tool that diminishes the light. It shouldn't be too mavhir and too mavhik that Moshe Rabbeinu should be able to receive it. Number two, because there is a keli after all, even though through the keli you're seeing b'derech oyer yasher, there is the maila of seeing through a keli, which is going to bring to you ultimately godliness, which would not be available if you saw without any aspaklari, without any keli at all. And number three, that the mashal for Aspaklari Meira is Teidum mitzvahs. What I'm trying to do is give the maimer a symmetry and order, and I know the Rebbe doesn't give it completely, but I think that this is the pshat. Now let's read inside on page 78, number 19. If I wish to add, says the Rebbe, that just like we spoke about Aspaklari She'ina Meira, three things. Number one, it allows you to see something. Number two, because you're seeing through a partial blockage, there's the advantage that comes from the blockage. And number three, there's a mashal, and by Aspaklari She'ina Meira, the mashal is guf and nefesh abahmis. And by Aspaklari Meira, the mashal is Teidum mitzvah. So the Rebbe, I want you to know this, that since Shadei Gam Bo Yeshni Helem, even a looking glass which allows you to see directly Aspaklari Meira, but because Shehim Alem is al Eitzem Habehikus, Vahabehiros, it diminishes the radiance and the gleam of the light canal, as we said before. Okmation is Bayal, as we explained on page 76, Aspaklari Meira, that the looking glass that allows you to see directly is a tool, is a medium that does limit the light so that you should be able to experience it, but it limits it in such a way that you're still able to see it directly. It's called Livush, the garments of Teidum mitzvahs. Shem Chachmos, the wisdom will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says that Teidum mitzvahs, even though its godliness directly is physical. Shelhel, which is a phenomenon of concealment. However, just like you have three ideas, Aspaklari She'ina Meira. Number one, that it allows you to see somewhat. And number two, because it blocks somewhat, it brings you to another advantage. The same is true in Aspaklari Meira, even though it's blocking less. But the fact that it blocks somewhat, because the Livush Gashmi brings an advantage in seeing through the Livush of Torah and mitzvahs versus seeing without that Livush. Let's read it inside. However, Torah and mitzvahs are garments that can hide and act as a medium for the light that reveals the light to Moshe Rabbeinu, but through the garment of mitzvahs. And again, the way that Rebbe explained it in the Maimer, that's what happens to every Neshama in Gan Eden. In Gan Eden, you have a Livush of Torah and mitzvahs that brings the Ein Sof to you, which is al derech Moshe aspaklarya meira the madreg of Moshe Rabbeinu. So this malbush hides a little bit so that you can see much and see directly, but it hides a little bit. This is self-proved that the Livush has a higher source than the light. That first of all, is able to act as a garment for the light. But directly the light is less down here than it is over there because it's blocking it. But on the other hand, by removing this blockage, you reach a higher madrega like the Maila of Echeza. It's not Echeza, but it's Kinyan Amal Echeza. Let's go back to what I told you about Nefesh HaBahmis. The Nefesh HaBahmis and the Guf cover over the Neshama, right? And you have to overcome them. And overcoming them, there's two parts. Number one, you have to come to godliness in spite of the Guf of the Nefesh HaBahmis. Number two, you have to come to godliness because of the Guf of the Nefesh HaBahmis. The Guf of the Nefesh HaBahmis have a higher source, and you could be mevara the Guf of the Nefesh HaBahmis and reveal a godliness which would not be available without them and their higher source. So the Rebbe says the same is true by Aspaklarya Meira. Even though Aspaklarya Meira is allowing you to see directly, not indirectly, but because it's diminishing the oir. So the koyach of Torah and mitzvahs as the melubish and gashmis has to be significantly powerful to diminish the havhoka and the havhora of Ein Sof. And the fact that they're powerful enough to diminish it means that they have a higher shadish. And when you use the Torah and mitzvahs themselves, you come to know a godliness that you would never know if you would see the godliness without a malbush at all, without a spaklari at all. Why? Because the gashmius of the Torah and mitzvahs has a higher shadish than the yashar. And he says, al derech erchezer. It's not mamish erchezer. Kanal be'inyan amal erchezer. It's not erchezer because this is her yashar. Aspaklarya meira allows it to a yashar. But because there's a semi-helam behester, and you're seeing through the malbush, and you're being mavara the malbush itself, so you're magala al derech, the even erchezer, a level of godliness which you would never know without aspaklarya meira. So you have a parallel here. Aspaklarya she'ina meira blocks and reveals. The shadish of the Spashana Meira is very high and allows you to know things you would never know without them. And the mashal is Guf and Nefesh HaBahmis. Aspaklarya Meira reveals by diminishing light. But because it diminishes light, that means that the Keli, the Malbush, the Aspaklarya has a higher shadish, and when you're mavared it, you can come to know God that you would never know. And the mashal for it is Torah mitzvahs. That's the parallel. Aspaklarya she'ina meira, its 3 points, and Aspaklarya ha'meira and her 3 points. Its 3 points. Khozer brings the pasuk that the dove is hidden in the cracks of stone, and the pasuk zarenius marachashminius kelech allow me to see your countenance and to hear your voice. Chag vesela means the guf of the nefesh habahamis, but says that amadrigizot nehelim vehester she was up to the guf nefesh habahamis, or befrat this managolos. Now, according to this maimer, you would have to say that the first helim vehester is not guf nefesh habahamis and golos; it's the levush gashmi of Torah and mitzvahs. Only through Aveda and Teiro mitzvahs hine. Beki Yoma Teiro mitzvahs, parenthesis, which is Aspaklarya Meira. And Bira Zichoch Nefesh HaBahmis, which is Aspaklarya She'ina Meira. And I would say that this is the union of Sechel, as the Rebbe explains their Mailin, the Maimarim of Tafshin Lamed Ches. Nasa Harinias Marach, you see the countenance of Elokut. So both Maris, Aspaklarya Meira and Aspaklarya She'ina Meira, that the mashal for it is Torah and mitzvahs and Guf and Nefesh HaBahmis respectively, bring you to a level of godliness that you would not have if you didn't have the malbush at all. That's the word of the Maimer. The Keli has a higher shadish than the Eir, and the Keli hides, on the one hand, to bring the Eir to you where you are, and number two, to allow you to access the godliness of the Keli, which is higher than the godliness of the Eir as it is even in its shadish. And the Rebbe goes back to the Kir. Right? Vayas meishes akir necheshes v'kanin necheshes b'mares hatzeves shesal pesach meid. The kir, which is the water basin that is necessary to wash your hands before you do any of it in the Beis HaMikdash, which will provide you as a permanent reference to Moshe Rabbeinu, but Moshe Rabbeinu, the halacha is, like I said in the beginning of the Maimer, you have to have a minimum of 4 faucets when you're washing your hands from the kiyah to represent Moshe and Bonov. Because the keach, to do the hachana, to all the avodah, the Beis HaMikdash comes from Moshe Rabbeinu, and it's made dafka from Maras HaTzevis. The very kiyah, which is the foundational, the introductory tool, the introductory keli for the introductory avodah in the Beis HaMikdash, is made from a Livush, because it allows you to have godliness which is higher than the godliness which is naturally revealed because of the Livush. That the kiyah is made from looking glasses that are called tzevis. So first of all, you touch the word maris. Maris, Lashon Rabim, a plural reference to maris, which literally means many mirrors. And the Rebbe is explaining up in many levels of mirrors. Looking glasses that allow you to see directly, aspeklarיא מאירה. Looking glasses that allow you to see indirectly, aspeklarיא שאינה מאירה. And you need these looking glasses to get godliness. So first of all, on the one hand, you're getting the godliness on a lower level, and second of all, because of the glasses themselves, you're going to reach madregas of godliness that would only be available through the keli. And then he says, point 2, they're called Maras HaTzevis. And the Rebbe does something very interesting. The Rebbe wants to explain the word Maras HaTzevis like the word Tzivis Hashem, the Maimer. In Chassidus you have Tzvois, and you have Tzivis Hashem. In Chumash, Yidden are called Tzivis Hashem, and in Tanakh there's the Shem Tzvois. Tzivis Hashem is in Atzilus, and Tzvois is in Biyah. Maris HaTzevis means looking glasses in Biyah. And we're saying Tzivis without Tzivis Havaya. It's Eisu B'Tzavadle, godliness in the lower worlds. And the Tzvois block and hide. And the avodah is to overcome the blockage of Tzvois and to raise it up to the Madrega of Tzivis Havaya. And if and when you raise it up to the Tzivis Hashem, they become even higher than Atzilus. So say it again. Maras HaTzevis means how the Maras, the looking class, brings godliness to you on the level of Biyah, like Tzvois in Biyah. And the avodah is to make for Maras HaTzvois Tzivis Havaya. So let's read it. V'zehu inyan Maras HaTzevis, 4 lines from the bottom of page 78. That's the content of these looking glasses, which are called Tzevis. That Mara, Gaz, a looking glass even, which allows you to see directly, is in from hell. Because of the hiddenness, Nasa Metzias, Ve'esh and Nvrayim, it allows the worlds to be a Metzias, and even to be Yesh. And Vavei, the Bittel and Nvrayim, and the purpose is to make a Bittel in the Nevrayim, to make from Maras HaTzevis, Tzivis Hashem. Or Bepratis Yesir, more specifically, as you read, the Neshama Lamata, the Neshama descended into this world, Ba'alam is Vesterim, the governor Neshama, and the hiddenness and the concealment of the body animal soul. Top of page 79, now Vavei, the work is live, Feil Ha'inyan, Tzivis Hashem, to influence in the Neshama Tzivis Hashem. That we shouldn't just be tzaves, Maris HaTzevis, it should be Maris HaTzevis lahavaya or havaya, that by taking the mare, which brings Elokut to you through a medium that separates, and as a result of it, you either don't have Elokut directly, only indirectly, or even if you have Elokut directly, have it in a diminished way, and you're mavared it, you raise it up to the madrega, sheyatafel u'batel lahavaya, should be the madrega of Atzilus. And l'chayr, it's not just Atzilus, it's even higher than Atzilus, like the Rebbe said before about the idea of Yidid Tzerech Aliyah. Says the Rebbe of Indians, their second line from the top of page 79, there's Adeya, is Bonaros bin Tzivis Guf. Explain what Tzivis means. And it says in Chassidus, again, it's in Teira Eden Pashas Boy, and then it's Barichas in the Basil Gani from the Friedrich Rebbe and the Rebbe, that Eisu B'Tzavadilei, Hainu, Shekol, and Avram Kvishem, which says of Yeshus, all the creations, in their form and in their Yeshus. They went through all the steps of hiddenness, even the step of the Ein Sof. So you see world, you don't see Elokut. The Hizbonus is that is Baruch. There's still one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. From one letter alone. So the Hizbonus is Eisu B'Tzavadilei. Even the place of maximum concealment, godliness really is because of the Inyan of Achdus. And this is a Hizbonus to see Hashem in the world. And the Rebbe continues and he says, you're mizbeinin not in Achdas Hashem, but you're mizbeinin in seeing Hashem in the world. This is the Madrega of Tzvois. And then he concludes, Vayidei his Bananus Zu. I am 6 lines. From the top of page 79 through this is Bananus, Mavatla as a Helam. You remove the hiddenness. And Maris HaTzevis becomes Tzivis Hashem. The It reveals Havaya in a direct way. And I'm going to argue that it's not just you reach Atzilus, you have to reach even higher, because of the principle of Yirid Tzedek Aliyah, like the Rebbe said earlier. And then he has another kvetch. This explains why also the Maras was made from the Cheshes. The copper is made from copper. Because in Kabbalah it's brought based on a pasuk that copper has a shaykhis with chutzpah. In order to be in this world and to overcome the Livushim of Teda mitzvahs, and certainly to overcome the Livushim of the Guf of the Nefesh abahmis, you have to be chutzpah. Mitcha means your forehead is a place of chutzpah. Like the Mishnah says, so the choishes is connected to the word mitcha chanechusha, which means chutzpah. I heard from one some Tzvi Gringwad alav shalom. So I'm looking at Gan Eden. I think it's okay to say the Mishnah as panim lagain and a beishas panim lagan Eden. I think it's if you are a very edel, a sheepish person, stay in koilo. Beishas panim lagan Eden. If you have chutzpah as panim, then you can go into elam hazeh and you can be mavaded the world, and you'll change the world, and the world won't change you. Vayakheil the keach, to be stronger than the world, to have chutzpah in the world, and they have to be mavaded the world, comes from Teda. And it's merumas in the word nechoshes, because nechoshes is a RaShaG neiv leis chochma shalamayla Teda, which is the name from halacha, l'cha'eda. So the kir is made from maras hanacheshes, maras atzeves. It's made from something which reveals godliness dafka by blocking it, and you have to overcome it. And when you overcome it, you reveal a higher level of godliness, tzivis havaya, and perhaps even higher than that. So we just explained what the kir was made out of, right? What the kir was made out of. It's made out of an obstruction. Not to obstruct, but to ultimately reveal a godliness which is only available by overcoming obstruction. And now we talk about the kir was used for. Once the kir was made, they washed their hands. V'hinei, mi maras hatzevis, from these mirrors, from these looking glasses which are called tzevis, yet the kir v'kani made the kir. As the pasuk says, hands and feet. And the Rebbe is going to connect hands to one inyan and feet to the other inyan. Yedei means the midas v'rachas, they would be midas. And agleim, which is Livush, and machshava dibur ma'aser v'zrachas agleim, says the Rebbe, who inyan has started Livush haraim, to move negative garments. Because binyan hell avik bar agleim, on the feet you have dust. And the Rebbe says regel machas the klipa, which machshava dibur ma'aser liyumazeh. So Yedeim and Agleim is like Aspaklarya Meir and Aspaklarya She'ina. Washing your hands means Teda mitzvahs that they need to be more perfected. Washing your feet means the involvement in the world, which is klipa and overcoming it. So Yedeim and Agleim is you're using the Maras Hatzevis, Maras Lashon Rabim, Aspaklarya Meir, Aspaklarya She'ina Meir, to be mavarer the Teda and mitzvahs, Yedeim, midas, and the Guf of the Nefesh abahmis, Agleim, ovok with the Shaychas to klipa. And you're washing your hands. You're purifying your Avodas Hashem in Teiro mitzvahs and in the beater of this world through the waters of the kir, which is rated up to a Shadish. And the waters themselves, the waters come from Chochma. Shenasan Moshe back here, that Moshe puts in the kir. Shenasan mimaras hatzeves, v'hainu shagam Livush Teiro mitzvahs. Ubir and Nefesh abahmis, both levels. Livush Teiro mitzvahs, which is a mashal of Aspaklarya Meir. And Livush birid nefesh abahmis, which is a mashal of Aspaklarya She'ina Meira, tzrichem rechitza, they're washed from the waters of Chochma. And you'll see in a minute why. And then he says, everything in the Mishkan requires you to wash your hands and your feet. That means to purify the malbush of Teda mitzvahs and the malbush of the guf of the nefesh abahmis. Hein laknisa leil made, both going into the Beis Hamikdash. Hein bakavas masbech shebachasa berach masbeyach, because eil made is eil matzilas, and chosar eil made is eil masbeyach. And a pizza move on shebeshelach nisrael made to go into the Beis Hamikdash and to go into the Mizbeach, which is called Batzil. You have to wash your hands. Bidur neisef aderachitza b'mei hachochma shebekir. U'mashe kosov tarchlis aderachitza gam because the Mizbeach, which is bia. Af sham Mizbeach hay bechatzel made not bia. Harei the fishikol bi derachachma v'chochma is beriru. Okay. Going into the Beis Hamikdash is going into Atzilus. So if we're going into Atzilus, it understands why you have to have Meha Chochma, because Chochma, Abilam, Akanan, Abba Atzilus. But if you're going into the Mizbeach, which is only Biyah, why do you have to have Chochma Atzilus Mevada that? So the Rebbe says a klal, because Chochma is Bidur, all Bidur is through Chochma. Harei Zelafish, a Kol Bira, they are Chochma, the Chochma is Bidur. The word of Chochma Bidur means like this. There's different kinds of Bidurim. There's Bidurim through Islapshus, there's Bidurim B'derech Oyer. But the rule is that even a bira through his lapshus, the real koyach for the bira, this is an Ein base in second chelik bariches, comes from chokhmah. So to go into the base of mikdash, you for sure need chokhmah, because it's the madrega of atzilus. And to be mevarer, birurim and biyah, you still need chokhmah, even though it's b'derech his lapshus. Gam yesh leimer, a second reason why to go to the mizbech you have to have me'ach chokhmah, because it says l'kut teira and biyam ki yakriv. The tchilu weisek teira, the beginning of everything is teira. Shazehu adam ki yakriv, the first thing is mensch, and then you go down to behema, min ha-behema, which is bidur nefesh ha-bahmit. So it's either because even the birurim of biyah need a koyach from chokhmah, or because if you want to endeavor to be mevarer anything, you have to start with above bidur, which is teira and chokhmah. So now the Rebbe just told us several interesting things. Most of the Maimed explained the process by which the kiyud is made and why it was made the way it was made. At the end of the Maimed, in this last page, he's explaining how we washed our hands. Washing our hands is the bidur of the Livushim mitzvahs. Washing our feet is the bidur of the guf and the nefesh abahmit, and the koyach for all of it has a confirmation Rabbeinu from chokhmah. And the Rebbe concludes, which will Moshe had to participate in making the kiyud and putting the waters into the kiyud. And like I said a few times, the Rebbe said at the beginning of this Maimer, forever we mention Moshe Rabbeinu, because you have to have water for a minimum of 4 kainim, and the 4th kain is Moshe, because Moshe is bittul de ma. Moshe is bittul of ma, like we learned by Riches in the previous Maimer, the Maimer of Mishpat. V'yisei is like madema, which means godliness in the dveikus nikeres, in a way of bittul be'atzmi, as the Rebbe said. Everything in the Mishkan happens through him, even though the whole idea of the Mishkan is birurim. But the kayach of all the birurim, in the beginning of all the birurim, is godliness, which is removed from all of the klipa, all of the blockages. Which explains why the kiyur in kloli ba Mishkan, it's a basic idea in the Mishkan. It was hachana for everything in the Mishkan. Kiklalos in Mishkan, the purpose of the Mishkan is to bring godliness into the world. And in this Maimed he says, is bring godliness in the world. Lachas lichas achet of the AVODA of Chet Egel. You know that the Rebbe has a Sechel in chelik vav, where he discusses 3 different shitas about the building of the Mishkan. According to one shita, the Mishkan is madrega of tzaddik, which means Hashem gave us the Mishkan before we sinned in the first place. According to the second shita, it's madrega bal tshuva, which means we were only told to build a Mishkan after we did AVODA. Otherwise our own homes would have been a Mishkan, and that our Maimed seems to be going in that set direction. And the third eifin is that the Mishkan doesn't change. It's so high, it's higher than Tzaddik and Chet, and therefore higher than Tzaddik than Bal Tshuva. This Maimer goes on the eifin that the Mishkan is a reaction to the AVODA of the Chet Egel. If not for the AVODA of Chet Egel, we wouldn't need a Mishkan. Says the Rebbe, because there was an AVODA, and the world has been compromised, and you have to have a house where godliness is going to be revealed as well before the sin. Is even higher than it was before the sin, because of the principle that about tshuva is higher than a tzaddik tshuva is flying l'tushia. So the beginning of every avodah in the Beis Hamikdash is Moshe Rabbeinu and the kiyur, because the kiyur is made for maras hatzevis. And what maras hatzevis? Yanuhu, that you have a helam, and idea helam, through the helam agim l'mayla yesem b'chinas erchezi, reach even higher, and the kiyur therefore represents the basic idea of the Mishkan in this particular model, that the Mishkan is the reaction to Chet, and not just surviving the Chet and reversing the Chet, but becoming better because of the Chet. All of this is accomplished by the kiyur and with the kiyur that comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. And then Rebbe finished with the Vayakheil, which we learned at the very beginning of the Maimer. Okay. Rabbi said, I think today's shir was clear, although some of you may say that some of the words I read rather quickly. But lakel eisus man, which means everything has a limit. I just made up a pshetl. Okay, I'll see you when I see you. Thank you for learning. Thank you for listening, and thank you for learning. We want Mashiach now.